Morning, everybody, and welcome to today's session on day 2 of Asia Trade Week. I'm Simon Baptist, Chief Economist of the Economist Intelligence Unit. Morning to everybody joining us in person here in Singapore and to all of our online participants across Asia and around the world. If you are joining us online, please do remember to check out all of the virtual booths that are available and all the features on our swap card platform. And for those in the room, you'll be able to log in and take a look at those features afterwards. But either way, whether we're in person or online, looking forward to an interesting discussion today about sustainable trade. I'd like to thank our sponsors for today's event, DP World, the Hinrich Foundation, JTI, NEAT, McKinsey Global Institute, and the Hong Kong government, including Invest Hong Kong, Hong Kong Trade Development Council, Hong Kong ISD, the Policy Innovation and Coordination Office, as well as the Hong Kong Maritime and Ports Board. So thanks for our sponsors for enabling today's discussion to take place. This morning, we're going to be focusing on the case for sustainable trade. What does sustainable trade mean, and what will it take to encourage trade to be more sustainable, whether that be from a policy perspective in government or from a corporate perspective in our own operations and across our supply chains. I'm joined today by 5 very knowledgeable panelists. I'm sure we'll have a very exciting discussion. First, we have Alvin Tan, Minister of State for Trade and Industry and also Community, Culture and Youth with the Singapore government. Thanks for joining us, Alvin. We also have Vandita Pant, who's the Chief Commercial Officer for BHP, one of the world's biggest resource companies and biggest shippers as well. We also next have Malavika Bambawale, the Managing Director for Sustainability at Engie Impact in APAC. And then also joining us, Ditlev Blicher, who's the APAC Managing Director for Maersk, one of the world's biggest shipping companies. And then also Louise Pender, who's the General Counsel and Chief People Officer for Zalora, the big fashion company I'm sure everybody has heard of. So we've got a range of perspectives today. We've got policy, we've got shippers, we've got people who ship things, people managing long supply chains. So we're going to get some great perspectives on sustainable trade. Before we kick off on our discussion up on stage, we've just got a short video we're going to show you. It's from the Hinrich Foundation, and we'll have a few words from Merle Hinrich, who's the chair, giving some of the highlights of the Sustainable Trade Index research that the Economist Intelligence Unit undertook, looking at how different economies are doing in terms of sustainable trade, which was sponsored by the Hinrich Foundation.
Hello, my name is Merle Hinrich, and I am the founder of the Hinrich Foundation. I'm delighted to offer a few words at the outset of today's agenda. During a career in Asia that reaches back over many decades, I have seen firsthand the economic and social benefits that trade brings, especially with the reduction of poverty. But I have also witnessed the cost in terms of the impact on the environment. Through these experiences, I've come to believe that the primary principle which underpins sustainable trade is balance. Balance between economic goals and the need to strengthen social capital and environmental stewardship. Trade, in other words, cannot be pursued solely on the basis of economic gains. For this reason, I established the Hinrich Foundation to support and advance sustainable trade. We do this through our research and education programs that build knowledge and leadership in trade. The Sustainable Trade Index is one of the ways in which we seek to contribute to the promotion of sustainable and mutually beneficial trade. This index measures the capacity of 20 economies, including 19 in Asia and the United States, and their participation in international trade in a manner that supports the long-term domestic and global goals of economic growth, environmental protection, and better social equity. This readiness for sustainable trade is evaluated across 27 indicators grouped under each of the 3 pillars of sustainability: economic, social, and environmental. The COVID-19 pandemic has provided a stark and painful reminder of why the concept of sustainable trade is so critical. Imbalanced trade practices, for instance, have played a key role in aggravating the health, economic, and social outcomes of the pandemic. It is now crucial for Asia to strike a balance between short-term goals and long-term resilience, especially as we endeavor to build back better. I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel on this critical topic and wish you all a productive and engaging summit.
So let me begin, Alvin, with you. I mean, Merle Hinrich spoke to us in the short video about how the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted, firstly, the importance of international connections, but also the importance of sustainability within those connections, right? So when things aren't resilient from an ESG perspective, then, well, the consequences can be quite large. So Singapore has built its economy as being a hub for all sorts of things, trade being one of them and moving things across borders. So for Singapore, how do you think about sustainable trade and how do you think it's changed through COVID-19? Do you still see the same future in being an international hub as was the case in 2019?
Yeah, well, good morning, Simon, and it's really a pleasure to be here. It's a really important question, so I wanted to frame it in a quite an interesting way. I see it as a marathon, and it's a marathon, but not a sprint. And if it's a long play, it's a long game, it's a long marathon. But COVID-19 has really effectively forced us into a sprint. And as it has forced us into a sprint, it's then now, are you sprinting in the right direction or the wrong direction? If you were to sprint in the wrong direction, then it would be that you would prioritize economic growth at the expense of the other two pillars, right? Environmental growth, social growth. And I think in the STI, there are some indications that some countries would be moving into the wrong direction. But at the same time, there will be also some countries moving in the right direction. I think Merle mentioned build back better, or some have coined the term build forward better. So the wrong direction and the right direction matters. The right direction, of course, is then you take the opportunity to build the economic side, the social side, and environmental side. In Singapore, it's not just the direction that we are trying to make sure that we're going into the right direction, but it's also the speed. And it's in any marathon, you want to make sure that your speed is constant, but you adjust, if you have a tailwind, if you feel better along the way, you adjust it accordingly. So I'll give you just two quick examples. One is on our carbon tax. We were the first Southeast Asian country to impose a carbon tax in 2019, $5 per metric ton of CO2 emissions. We're planning to have it at about $10 to $15 by 2030, but then we're going to calibrate the speed of how we run. So by 2023, we'll see how it goes, and we may calibrate it again. The same way with regards to our NDC and LEADS commitments, right? We're planning to peak carbon emissions at 65 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030, half it to 33 million metric tons by carbon dioxide equivalent by 2050, and then have net zero by the end of the half of the century. But we will adjust it accordingly, according to pace. So the first is direction, second is speed, and we think about the third one, which is critical, it's on partners. And we were talking, Simon, earlier about the different partners. We have our private sector teams here, we have ASEAN, we have trade associations, we have free trade agreements, which I think we'll talk about that in detail later on. But all of this, the direction, the speed, as well as partners, I think all play an important role in this marathon, spurred on by COVID as it brings us in different directions. But all three aspects will help us to understand and to shape how sustainable trade will feature in this new normal.
So what's the role of Singapore as a trading hub? So I guess one reason why Singapore became a trading hub is because it's very low regulation. So things can come in and out without tariffs, and with limited customs and regulatory barriers.
Yes.
What can Singapore be doing to improve the sustainability of the trade, or is there nothing it can do? Is it to do with the buyers and sellers at the other ends of the supply chains?
Yes. Simon, if you look at it again using the race analogy, along the race you want to be able to take in fluids, you want to take in bananas or any other aspects, and we are trying to put that into this as we run this race. It could be in a form of green finance. That's one. It could be in the form of our free trade agreements. So the EU-Singapore FTA, the China-Singapore FTA has green components in them. But we are also very much working towards being a CCUS hub, carbon capture, usage and storage hub, and also how to ensure that there are sustainability bonds. So in the green finance space, for example, we are working with our ASEAN partners to have ASEAN green bond standards. We are contributing significantly to the Bank of International Settlements green bond funds. And all of this taken into concert helps Singapore to be that hub and to help to set the stage for regions to bring on all of these green investments and also new kinds of, not just innovation, but investments into this hub concept.
And do you think, because you talked about Singapore's climate change commitments, which sort of have increased over the last couple of years.
That's right.
But for a country of its wealth, they're relatively unambitious, right? For a country of Singapore's GDP per capita level. Do you think that the fact that Singapore is so exposed to international trade has been a hindrance in taking a tougher stance on climate change?
No, there are two aspects to this. The first is, if you look at our carbon emissions, it's 0.11% of global carbon emissions. Number two, we are a city-state, and there are not many city-states out there. That means that in the land area, in terms of how we are using our land and our resources, we have to be very innovative. We have to make sure that we use it efficiently. So this week in Parliament, and Parliament starts, budget in Parliament starts tomorrow, in fact, we will be discussing something which we launched in about a couple of weeks earlier. It's the SG Green Plan 2030. And those are very ambitious targets. And as I mentioned earlier on, it's a marathon. We are calibrating these targets. We're going to plant 1 million trees. We're going to build our green finance hub. We're going to build green economy. But these are not, Singapore always, if we set a target, we want to make sure that we hit them. We won't set targets which we can't. And as I mentioned earlier on, we'll calibrate the speed. We will announce more details of the SG Green Plan in Parliament later this week. But I'm happy to share more later if you would so deem.
Great.
It'll be interesting.
Yeah. Transitions is a good moment to bring in Vandita Pant from BHP, because of course BHP is now involved in its own transition around sustainability. You have a new CEO that's put a bit more focus on this area. So, of course, BHP has a history. Probably a fairly unsustainable history in some ways, right? So big investments in thermal and coking coal and carbon-intensive industries such as steel making. But your new CEO has announced a vision of wanting to move into more sustainable areas of business. And I'm thinking particularly with your role in supply chains, because a lot of your products are often the early stages of other people's supply chains. And you move probably one of the biggest movers of tonnage across borders of any company. Could you tell us about how BHP's thinking about sustainable trade and what your plans are?
Sure, Simon. Just to put it in perspective, in fact, in our industry, BHP has taken a lead in sustainable, be it social value related things, be it around trade, be it around our own emission footprint for decades. So we are the lowest carbon emitter intensity miner in the world, in spite of our scale. So that's the starting point. However, as you rightly said, we know that decarbonization and industry transition is one of the largest, if not the largest challenge of our era. And we have a role to play. In fact, we take full accountability as the world's largest natural resources company to play our part in it. That's accountability, but also there is absolute expectation from different stakeholders around that. So the expectations of our investors, our community, our partners, our consumers, our customers are increasing on this, making the value chain sustainable. So I think that is the second part. And the third part is that actually this brings good sustainable value with a capital S on sustainable value, because in my mind, decarbonization, energy transition, sustainable trade, sustainable value, and commercial value for a company like us is one and the same. And why do I say that? In 1.5-degree world, if we go with the Paris-aligned ambition, the world needs more than double copper in next 30 years than it did in last 30. World needs 4 times nickel in next 30 years than it did in last 30. So in a way, BHP is not only we need to be acknowledging it, we are absolutely essential to have those sustainable supply chains, value chains, and products available to have that part, take that part. And I do think of it as a life cycle, as you rightly said. BHP commodities are upstream. And what that means is if you think of the value chain or value life cycle of our product and become accountable for that and liver into it, that's the way to do it. So not only our operations, but I would give you an example. No single company or just private sector, as Alvin was saying, their partnerships are important across private and public sector with customers. We have recently done an MOU partnership, $35 million, putting into that investment with the largest steel mill in China, China Baowu Group, where we will look at enabling steel industry, which is customers of ours, with the lower footprint. We also are accountable for how we ship our products, as you said, with the 2,000 voyages a year of chartering of ships. And in that, we have just chartered the world's first chartering award for LNG Newcastle Max dry bulk carriers, which will reduce the emission footprint of our carriage of those commodities by more than 30% per voyage. And this is just a few examples of the things that we become part of the solution, because the world needs companies like us to be sustainable from end-to-end perspective.
And to what extent today do you feel like you have visibility on that end-to-end sustainability? When you sell a product, do you monitor what then happens to it? And can you, even if you want to?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think of it as three levels, Simon. One is responsible sourcing. So what we source, be it shipping or be it things which come into our mines, power, what is the footprint there? Are we able to measure it? The second is actually process stewardship, which is how do we run our own footprint of operations? So, as I said, we are the lowest emission company in our sector, but equally, we have done, our mines in Chile from 22 onwards will be 100% renewable power consumers. Recently done Queensland, 50% of our power for our met coal mines will come from renewables. So that footprint, we know, we measure it. And then the third is the product stewardship, that what happens with our product as it goes to consumers or customers, and are we able to help? And we are looking at all of these. Just on your questions, it's very topical because we've just finished our first trial of blockchain for trade with the Baowu, again, it so happens, which will capture the carbon emission intensity of the cargo which is going. And that's something that we are also replicating for nickel, because the traceability of that commodity, not just for our customer, which is the nickel precursor, but even the end user of a car, of electric vehicle, will want to know what it is. So it's a journey, but really very focused on it.
Yeah. And what's the transmission mechanism like of that information down the supply chain? Because if we think about steel, for example, if you have a steel mill in Europe that's going to be subject to much tougher emission standards than a steel mill in China. And so perversely, that means the steel mill in China is going to be able to afford high prices for their raw materials because they're not, say, paying the emissions taxes that a mill in Europe is going to be. How can that play into decision making? Does that impact upon who you decide to sell to, or is that a matter for downstream regulation?
I look at it as three things. One is the intent. And I would say, given what we have seen in the last 6 months around climate pledges and real action backed by different countries in Asia, that is not to be taken lightly. And those are very bold challenges being looked at, given the starting point of those economies. The after intent comes out that we, of course, are selling it to the customer. So in a way, we could say, wash our hands away and say, nothing to do with me. But that's not the approach we are taking. In fact, in September last year, BHP has come out with Scope 3, which is Scope 3 goals, which is the emissions of our customers, and saying, we will enable, by partnering with our customers, wherever they may be, to enable them to find technological pathways to reduce emissions by 30% from intensity by 2030, which can be scaled up thereafter. And Bavu, as I was saying, and since then we have done JFE, which is the second largest steel mill in Japan, similar MOU, whereby we're putting $35 million in one partnership, $15 million in another, multi-year partnership to figure out different low carbon emission technologies. And the beauty of this, because this has to be done at ecosystem level, is everything that we discover around the feasibility of it and how it works, what products work or not, this will be open architecture knowledge share. So we will be putting all that we learn from it in the public arena so that other players can learn from it as well.
Okay, that's a good point for me to bring in Malavika, talking about the difference in the policy and regulatory environment in different jurisdictions. So you at Engie Impact do a lot of work with corporates, helping them to understand their sustainability footprint and what they need to do. What's some of the, I guess, advice or conclusions that you typically find when you're advising international companies who are doing cross-border and international transactions?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So I work with a green energy company, and specifically on the advisory side. So we kind of help a lot of our clients to decarbonize. And when we say clients, I'm talking about both governments as well as corporates. And we see that, I guess, one of the things I want to say is sustainability is a very complex journey, both for governments as well as for clients. And when it comes to sustainability in trade, it's even more complex because you're talking about these borders, right? So when you talk about trading goods and services across borders, you have to actually align all the policies across borders. You have to make sure that the carbon footprinting is being done in the same way. You have to make sure that you're accounting for taxes and subsidies in the same way. You have to account for things like Scope 3. How do you do all of that? It's incredibly complex. And when you look at corporates, corporates are also struggling with sustainability. Firstly, they don't know where to put the subject. Is it a finance subject? Is it an operations subject? But then also, they're also struggling with where is the regulation? Should we be ahead of the regulation? Should we be behind the regulation? So when you talk about trading goods and services, there is a lot of complexity around how do we measure this and what does it mean for my GDP growth or my revenue growth, etc. But so that's one side of it where I guess what we're saying is expect this to increase and not decrease. So for those companies that are shying away from, this is too complex, I don't think we can deal with it, I think the message is there's a huge resurgence of interest in ESG, and there's only going to be, at the moment, when you look at free trade agreements, they're talking about guidelines. But because of the pressure, I think that there's going to be a lot more regulation going forward and a lot more stringency in measurement, etc. So expect a lot more on that front. Secondly, when you look at the process of trade, so when you're looking at the trade industry itself, and for example, maybe perhaps Maersk, or you're looking at ports, you're looking at logistics, you're looking at shipping, there itself, there's a lot more focus on sustainability as well. So, we're talking about the energy efficiency of ships, we're talking about switching to green fuel, we're talking about things like circular economy and reducing waste in that sector, and there seems to be a resurgence of those topics as well. So I think that, and that's one place where NG comes in, and we can say, for example, supply green fuels, and we see a lot of interest in that aspect as well.
You said that you think you expect to see more regulation. I mean, linking back to Alvin's point about sort of Southeast Asia and what's happening in the ASEAN on the ASEAN front. I mean, climate and sustainability policy in Southeast Asia has been relatively unambitious so far. So I mean, across all countries, we have seen recently, which Vandita mentioned, a couple of notable changes. So Japan and South Korea and China this year or last year, all announcing carbon neutral targets. We'll have to see how the implementation of that goes. But there's been a change in rhetoric, at least in the Asia region.
Yeah.
What actual policies do you think we might see? Like, do you think we're going to see more carbon taxes? Do you think we're going to see more regulations about emissions intensity or around ESG standards on stock exchanges? What regulations specifically do you think people are going to be facing?
I mean, just to maybe comment on the fact that the region may be a little bit behind, and as you rightly said, I think there's a difference between what the developed countries are doing in the region versus the ones that are developing, and rightly so, because I think often it's seen that economic growth is maybe clashing with sustainability. But I think increasingly people are realizing that if you look at the impact of climate change on GDP, you see the APAC region, actually there's going to be like, it's a 2% or 4% decrease in GDP by 2060 because of climate change. So there's an increasing realization that economic growth is very tightly linked with sustainability. Now, when you look at regulation, I think there's also the realization that the climate change related economic activities are actually generating a lot of industry growth and a lot of economic growth. So there's opportunity not just in new types of technologies, but new types of energies, but there's also things like nature-based solutions that can provide income and a lot more activity. So I think, Singapore is, of course, in the Southeast Asia region, sort of leading the way through the SG Green Plan and other measures and the carbon tax, etc. But I think there's also been some interest in tightening the NDCs. I believe there are others like Thailand, Vietnam, etc., that are also sort of looking at tightening their NDCs. And I think when it comes to regulation, it's not easy to say, but there's work around what is the right way to create markets, to create trading hubs, and to create sort of an ASEAN-wide set of measures and guidelines that can ease the fruition of some of these opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Ditlev, can I bring you in now? So you work for Maersk, one of the world's biggest shipping companies. So you have your own emissions, and then you're also a part of everybody's supply chain. Something interesting that I wanted to kick off with, because everybody likes a new toy or a new a new shiny thing to look at. You've recently accelerated work on a CO2 neutral container vessel. Can you just start off by telling us about how that came about and how and why did you manage to accelerate it so much?
No, absolutely. Thanks for the question. It really came about last week, where we announced the first commercially viable carbon neutral vessel in the world. In conjunction with that, we also reaffirmed a commitment that all new build vessels will be carbon neutral capable. So it's a big commitment that really ties back about 3 years, where we reviewed our sustainability strategy and program. Mm-hmm. We thought that we need bolder action, so we established a moonshot goal, if you will, of becoming completely carbon neutral by 2050 and reducing all our carbon emissions by 60% by 2030. Part of that, we also committed to providing the world with a carbon neutral vessel. Mm-hmm. That we have sped up. So the last 2 years, we have really looked at a lot of different technologies, available in the market. But it's not just about the vessel. It's about creating an entire ecosystem that will allow us to actually operate it in a feasible manner. That came to fruition, and we just announced that last week. So it's a very big day for us as an organization, and we're very excited about this progress.
So you're making some progress in sort of moving towards, I guess, a lower carbon or ultimately a no carbon kind of shipping future. Are your competitors moving at the same pace, faster pace, a slower pace?
I think when we're looking at both the competitive environment as well as the larger ecosystem of our suppliers and our clients, is moving at different speeds. Maersk, as being the largest container shipping company in the world, we believe that we have a moral obligation to lead in this space. But there are many different avenues that you can take. There are many different options in terms of how are you going to address carbon neutrality. We believe that a moonshot approach was appropriate. So we believe it was better to hold off, not going to interim steps with, for instance, utilizing other fossil fuels like LNG that are better than where we are today, but it's only a step in the right direction. We believe that we really needed to make a quantum leap. Mm-hmm. So it was a challenge internally to our organization, and it was a challenge as well to all of our suppliers, shipbuilders, et cetera, to go in and address this challenge.
Because a difficulty in the shipping industry, I mean, similar to aviation, is that it is inherently transnational. Yeah? And so shipping and aviation have sort of been excluded from national regulations and climate commitments to date, and the IMO and the ICAO have been trying to make progress on that. But from that perspective, there's always a challenge that if you take some steps to operate a lower carbon vessel, which I assume at the moment at least is more expensive, and there's not the regulatory push because of the transnational element. There's no international carbon tax to kind of incentivize everybody to decarbonize their bunker fuels. Does that become a competitive problem for you because, say, your Chinese or Korean competitors are probably not moving as fast as you are?
I think you could interpret it as being such, but I also think it's a false trade-off. I think right now there's a commercial requirement for real movement, mm-hmm. In sustainability, particularly as it relates to carbon neutrality and the fight for climate change. So I think the time for sitting back and waiting for everybody else to move, it's been passed. So where you have significant players in their field, and this is what I'm talking about. We believe we have an obligation as a leader in our field to lead in this space. Now we don't have all the solutions. We do not know yet what the entire supply chain of, in this instance, is methane, that's used for propulsion. There's still many questions that needs to be answered and problems that needs to be solved. But it's about making those scary first steps and saying we're stepping into the future, we're making a commitment as a leader, and we are going to bring along with us our suppliers, and eventually also creating this a competitive advantage together in collaboration with the competitive field.
Do you think your customers are going to be willing to pay higher freight rates or higher charter rates for low emission ships?
I think so. At least in the short term, we have an obligation, of course, to come up with commercially viable solutions to sustainability. Those things have to go hand in hand. However, you also recognize when you start brand new technologies, typically you have higher cost up front. We are seeing from our client base, which really spans many different sectors, many of which are represented on this panel, that there's a distinct appetite for it, and now not just articulated, but also as it relates to dollars and cents. We established a product was called Eco, which was an offset with biodiesel as an instance, and we can't produce enough of it. Right. So we can't source enough of it more specifically. So we are seeing that demand happening, and I expect that to continue.
I'm going to move on to discuss some of the products that are going on your containers and bring in Louise. But just a reminder to everybody online that we are seeing your questions as they come in. So after I have a chat to Louise, I'll see if there's any questions from the audience. So if anyone online would like to ask something, please do put it into the Q&A box, and then we'll see it up on stage. And then, of course, in the audience, get your courage up to prepared to raise your hand and ask a question. So, Louise, you're general counsel at Zalora. So, I guess you've had a lot of experience with regulations in an international context. But I mean, your products, of course, are many of the ones that are on Maersk ships. Fashion famously has kind of long and very agile and fast supply chains. When you're looking at thinking about sustainability and perhaps some of the risks from a legal perspective that might play out along your supply chain, how much visibility do you have today with current monitoring systems? Like, what do you know and what don't you know about your supply chain?
Well, actually, it's a really interesting point. We launched our first sustainability strategy last year, and I think one of the key things we did is set ourselves 5 core principles, and one of those core principles was really about setting the base. Mm-hmm. So we spent a lot of time last year measuring our impact. We really wanted to find out where we were starting from so we could really track the journey that we were making as we go along. And actually, very excitingly, having had 1 year of our public strategy, in a few weeks we'll be releasing our first sustainability report, and we'll be making ourselves very accountable through transparency in terms of that progress that we're making. So in terms of the measuring that we did, we spent a lot of time also looking at our transport impacts. We actually, in our first year, something that we were very proud to achieve is we managed to achieve our first carbon footprinting across our entire supply chain. Mm-hmm. So we have, coming out of our first year now, a really clear picture of where our key impacts are. Not only environmentally from the carbon side, but also our impacts socially. And I think what that's been able to us achieve is a greater level of transparency. So we've spent a lot of time working in a lot of detail across our supply chain, not just with our logistics suppliers, but with our brand suppliers, to bring them on the journey with us. That's resulted in a number of really key initiatives in terms of some of the things that we've been able to achieve. I guess transport for us is, bizarrely, one of the lesser of our impacts that we have. We're more indirectly impacting our carbon emissions on the transport side. One of the key areas that we've really had to focus on from an environmental perspective is the manufacturing process through our brands. That's our key impact. Mm-hmm. So 75% of our carbon emissions comes through that manufacturing process, whether it's through our private labels or through the thousands of brands that we're selling on our sites. So really for us now, it's about working in collaboration with those partners, whether it's on the logistics side or our brand partners, to bring them on the journey with us. We're finding that sustainability for us, even after a really tough COVID year, has been a great growth lever for us. So we've been able to launch things, for example, like our new Earth Edit range, where we clearly defined a set of sustainability criteria for the products that we wanted to sell, so eco-friendly, sustainable materials, those sorts of things. And we actually managed to launch during that crazy year, 40,000 SKUs of sustainable products across 900 brands. That meant collaborating with each of those brands, in a lot of detail to set targets and bring them on that journey with us. So I guess one of the key things that I'm finding is, that ability to, from the position we're in, I think we've got a really key opportunity in the market to be able to drive that greater transparency right across our value chain. And our customers are demanding it. Our customers are also holding us accountable for that. So it's quite an exciting prospect for us going forward.
And when you talk about the response from customers, I mean, I've asked a few other panel members as well. I mean, do you find customers are willing to pay more for a more sustainable product? Because fashion is a very competitive sector.
We didn't when we started our strategy, we didn't go into it initially thinking about what our customers wanted. Very important, we're customer-centric. But we did it because we felt as a management team that it was the really right thing to do. And we entered into a lot of engagement with our leadership base, and our employee base. And what we discovered in doing that and in drafting our initial strategy is this happened to be a core value for us, which was a great surprise to really learn that. And knowing we've got a very young, fashionable, innovative set of employees in our group, we assumed that would be replicated in our customer base. We've got millions of active customers across the region. So we spent a lot of time then. So we kind of went the backwards way and went to the customers last and started asking them. It was clear, in terms of all of the questions that we were asking them is, that they were really wanting us to provide a more sustainable offering. We know specifically that greater than 60% of the customers that we surveyed are willing to pay more for a more sustainable product. So, this now is not only just something that we need to do for the planet and the people and to be an accountable operation, but it's really something that our customers are demanding.
How do you transmit the information to your customers? Because we're talking about sustainable trade, and your products move across borders a lot and far, right? And so there can be huge distances across many jurisdictions between production and consumption. Then maybe the environment where or like the situation where a product ends up. It's not just a Zalora context, right? And so how do you let your customers know about the sustainability features of or status of your products?
So just as we're requiring our supply chain to be more transparent to us, we're also providing that level of information to our customers. So we published our strategy online, which I must admit was quite scary when we first did it as our first foray into this. But we've also been holding ourselves accountable to that. We will be releasing our public report in a couple of weeks, which will be clear on where we did well, but also where we didn't do so well, and we've got more work to do. We've also held ourselves accountable in terms of our manufacturing process. So we took the step of publishing our factory list online last year for the first time. So that information is now publicly available for everyone to see. I think one of the things in terms of the approach we're taking is that it has to be really authentic to us as an organization. And the only way that we can really do that is by providing this level of transparency across our supply chain.
May I just challenge maybe what you were mentioning before, that there's a trade-off between higher cost and being able to accomplish sustainable or real step changes in carbon neutrality as an example. We did a little bit of work on this, and I think you find the further up the supply chain you go, probably the more carbon intensive it is in many examples. And for our point of view, we looked at if you double the cost of fuel for moving to a different fuel source, if I have the impact of bananas, for instance, for the consumer, that impact will be 1 penny per banana. if you go in and look at sneakers or shoes or something like that, the average is around 5 to 6 pennies. So I think a lot of it is when we just look at our own ecosystem, yes, it's a big impact. With transparency throughout to the final consumer, I think you will go in and see that impact is very achievable. But it requires for understanding to be traced throughout the entire value chain. So I do want to go in and saying it's a natural reaction that says, hey, really making a step change in this comes with a big economic price tag, which it does in some sense. But when you take it all the way to the final analysis, that impact is actually a lot smaller. And transparency in that, I think, can assist in moving this faster.
A lot of recent free trade agreements have focused on this transparency question, right? Trying to introduce common standards. And actually, I did, Alva, wanted to ask you from your government perspective about the free trade agreement element. But we had a question that's come in online from Chloe Deng at Consulum. With the current free trade agreements, RCEP, and I guess we could add in things like CPTPP and some of the bilaterals like the Singapore UK and the Singapore EU that have come in recently. How do countries coordinate their policies and regulations for sustainable trade despite their different development levels?
Yeah, well, thank you, Chloe, for the very important question. Let me just put it into a couple of different buckets. The first is that there is a general interest in companies that sign up for these FTAs and RCEPs, including RCEP is a trade agreement, to look into ways in which to lower tariff barriers for sustainable goods and services. That's one principle. And if you lower these barriers, it enables these transfers of goods and services across borders. That is critical because, first of all, you have to remove these barriers. That's the first principle. You remove these barriers for renewables and new kinds of energy. I think that's critical. The second aspect is we need to also understand and respect some of these trade tools and trade rules. So the NDCs, we were pushing for greater standards, higher standards for NDCs. And I know there has been all of these different challenges with regards to different development levels in different countries. At the same time, there are already, we ought to also respect the WTO rules, the UNFCCC rules, but then also respect different countries' development goals and standards. But at the same time, as Simon really mentioned earlier on, we're already seeing some of these countries in the Asia-Pacific, China, Japan, South Korea, making rhetoric to say, in addition to these trade agreements and free trade agreements and FTAs, we are committing ourselves to higher standards in a shorter time span. Now, of course, you then need to hold that to account to see whether they can reach those targets, which is why I mentioned that Singapore, we are trying to make sure that these targets, we set them, but in the process, we calibrate our speed. And we make it open to say, for example, our carbon tax, yes, we're going to hit it maybe $10, $15 by 2030, but by 2023, we're committed to reviewing it and seeing whether we need to make adjustments and looking at this whole ecosystem. I think Louise and Ditlev mentioned about there are many different aspects towards, for example, consumer behavior, which will also drive and enable governments to make these decisions that to meet these commitments earlier. The other aspect, to be very specific to Chloe's point, is on the FTAs, and we talked about this, Simon, earlier on. Let me just talk about the EU-Singapore FTA as well as the China-Singapore FTA, where there are environmental chapters in them. So, for example, they're committed to reduce barriers to trade in environmental goods and services. It's also committed, for example, the EU-Singapore FTA, to increase sustainable energy sources through trade and investment, reduce tariffs, and also to help to have some form of regulatory convergence, which is a challenge that, Simon, you mentioned earlier. There's been a lot of discussions on that front. The EU-Singapore FTA, we have, in fact, a EU-Singapore FTA Trade Sustainable Development Board meeting in November that talks about all of these aspects together. But I think what's even more critical is to what my counterparts in the private sector is seeing on the ground, is that it has to be not just consumer-driven, and consumers need to understand across the transparency chain that it may not be that much of a cost in the near term, or even in the longer term. But I think, Malavika, you also mentioned a very important point, which I was eagerly taking notes in. And you mentioned earlier that the impact of climate change on GDP, it'll be reduced by 4 to 5% by 2060. That is the negative aspect. But there's also the opportunity in GDP growth leading up as well. And we want to focus on that aspect. But people, citizens, consumers all have to play their part. Citizens putting some accountability on governments, and that's why we have this SG Green Plan, working together with our citizens to make sure that we can push these through sustainably and quickly, but also consumers holding companies into account and also saying, I want to purchase more sustainable goods and services. I think those in concert help us to drive toward our goal a little bit quicker.
Great, thanks for the context.
No problem. Yeah.
We have another question online, and then I'll come out to the audience, see if anyone in the room wants to join in. Question from our online participant. Sustainability initiatives often refer to the environment or climate change. What about social initiatives? Is anybody doing anything in social sustainability? Yeah, Vandita?
I'm happy to go because this is something we are very, very focused on. In fact, in a natural resources company, there's always been talk about social license to operate because you live in communities. Your assets are there for decades, and you need a social license to innovate. Where that journey has taken us to actually is to morphing that concept into social value rather than social license to operate, which is more than just a regulatory aspect, more than the minimum. So social value, the way we define that, is what is it that that community across your asset needs, and then you get focused on that and deliver that. And this came to life during pandemic in a very big way. If we look at the social value or stakeholders around us, could be our suppliers, could be the small businessmen who supply goods to us, could be the local community. And during the pandemic, within last year, March, if I remember correctly, we could see this is going, this is going to cause an issue, the pandemic as was coming. And within almost a week, second week of March, we announced that we will shift our payment terms. BHP buying stuff from global, lots of suppliers, shift payment terms down to 7 days globally. And any penny which was overdue for whatever reason, which we owed to our counterparts, we will release the cash, even if it was under dispute. Because we see that the ecosystem need for cash will be high given the pandemic. And it was not only the right thing to do, it was a fantastic thing because our suppliers, our local community buyers, actually stood up and stepped up to ensure that our operations did not stop for a day. Did not stop for a day. And that's one aspect of social value. I would talk about Chile. It's not today, but over last decade, we have spent $4 billion in desalination plant for our operations in Chile because the copper mine, the largest copper mine, is in the middle of the desert, to ensure that we can stop taking fresh water that the communities need for our operations. And this was, someone would have said, a foolhardy investment. And actually it's not, because you have got the community with you. And secondly, it's a competitive advantage now because our operations there have stopped using fresh water for the mine operations. And this is quite central, I think, to think of sustainable trade, because through the life cycle, it does start at the origin.
Oh, thanks for the examples. Lev, I think you had something on social sustainability.
Yes, I thought it was very valid to call it out, because it is true that climate change takes a lot of the oxygen, if you will, in the room. From our point of view, we believe it's closely intertwined. We think that trade in and of itself, which is really our business, is driving so many people to come out of poverty, as an example, and it still has the potential to do so. So, from our point of view, it's really very central. We believe that what we can do is we can what we call democratize logistics or access to the global markets. So whether you're a farmer somewhere in Africa or a producer of widgets somewhere else, we're trying to make it simpler to provide access to everyone to the global markets. And that indirectly has a large social component to it. Mm-hmm. Secondarily, we have a more direct impact. Being a global organization is to go in and ensuring global standards. And in many places that we operate, the regulatory environment is maybe not as mature to have those types of standards. And here we have, again, an obligation to work both through our own operations, but also those of a number of our suppliers and in our ecosystem. Mm-hmm. One example would be the sustainable vessel recycling. So this is something that gained some notoriety over the last couple of years, where as an organization, we sat down with a number of these providers to ensure that the best practices were deployed. We had people on site for over 2 years to ensure that throughout the recycling of 7 vessels of ours, there was not a single hour of downtime or lost time injury recorded. That is just one example of how I think, again, global organizations with global reach have a responsibility, and for us that social component is very critical.
Maybe if I just might add, we started from the opposite end in terms of our strategy. So we actually came from a history of focusing on social compliance, and whether it was the audit initiatives that we had in place in our factories or with our foreign workers, and we went the other way around into the sustainability side of things. So yeah, for us it started with really making a positive difference to the people that were working in our supply chains.
And that supply chain issue is for you, it's very central, of course. Yeah. For us, the supply chain issue is probably not that central, but even then, the human rights in the supply chain and adherence to those regulations is something which has become really critical to the way we look at onboarding our suppliers. Mm-hmm. And it's a mix of really taking quite a leadership position in our sector around how we track on board, look at the supply chain, human rights in our suppliers' construct, and in fact, even look at third-party audits for high-risk suppliers as classified or high-risk jurisdictions, and have that boots-on-the-ground approach to it. And then the issue of this is quite tricky, because you can't say, I'll stop buying from you. It's almost say, so what's the improvement plan? And working with that supplier to enable them to create the capacity to start to shift their way of thinking.
Yeah. Simon, if I oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add 2 quick things on the social side. I think one is that I think digital platforms, and I think you were referring to that a little bit as well. I think digital platforms are allowing smaller suppliers to come into the mainstream in a much easier way, and I think that needs to be allowed more. And I think some ways in which that can be done perhaps is larger companies are setting aside a percentage of their procurement from smaller companies and SMEs. So I mean, that's something that can be made much easier, and all those barriers that you had about reaching out to those companies earlier have now dissipated. And just one quick other point was labor practices. I think there needs to be a lot of emphasis, as we're talking about free trade agreements. I think it's important to make sure that labor practices are properly measured and properly adhered to, so that there's no leakage, right? So if there's a continent that has a stronger set of practices, but they're importing garments from a continent that doesn't, it kind of defeats the purpose. So that's something that really needs to have stronger legislation around as well. Sorry, Evan.
Simon, I was just about to say, from a government perspective, social is inherent in government. Because it's really about the people that live in your country. I was just thinking about 55, 1963. It's about 54 plus odd years ago. our founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, planted the first Mempat tree. And that has been quite critical, and sustainability has been a core component in Singapore's approach to nation building and social initiatives and the social imperative from way back in 1963, when he first planted the first Mempat tree. And every year, in the constituencies, we do that. And we have this as part of our SG Green Plan, planting a 1 million trees movement. That's one aspect of the SG Green Plan. But there are many others as well, including something where we have to be a little bit more tight with regards to vehicle ownership. So a car here is obviously more expensive. We've just increased our fuel taxes. And these things we need to be quite practical. Because if not, then you would have jams, you would have smog and the likes. And we are continuing to innovate and be very pragmatic in these things. So for example, increasing charging points to 60,000, which we're trying to phase out internal combustion vehicles to EVs. And so that's very, very much making sure that these are social aspects that we are catering to. But at the same time, we're not just saying we're going to take away these cars, we're then also building up alternatives, public transport. One MRT between every 600 meters of a home. So these are really very important pragmatic aspects that we're putting into the social aspect of living in a country. Trees, reducing vehicles, for example, and other aspects that are important. Yeah.
We've just got a couple of minutes left, but let me see if anybody from the floor would like to come in with a question.
Thank you. Andrew Staples from the Hinrich Foundation. Thanks very much to the panel for the fascinating insights into your approaches to sustainable trade. And my question really is, in the context of building back better, COVID-19 is an accelerant. Have you got any specific examples of initiatives that that you have launched, will be launching, as we attempt this build back better? Thank you.
Let's just take each of the three questions, and then we can address them together.
Chris Humphrey from the EU ASEAN Business Council. The EU launched its new trade policy last week with a heavy emphasis on forcing partners to sign up to Paris Agreement commitments and to the EU Green Deal. I just wanted to get the panel's views. Do you think the EU is going too far on the green element of sustainable trade at the cost of the social elements?
Okay, and then we had, one question over here.
Hi, my name is Aaron from the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. I just had a question for the panel on whether there's any concerns or any thoughts on how we can resolve the issue of environmental regulations perhaps being perceived as non-tariff barriers in major markets. Yeah.
Okay. So let's start off with Andy's question on building back better. Would anyone have a thought on that? Is COVID an opportunity to build back better, or does it set the course back because we're all distracted?
Yeah, maybe I can start at that. I do think there is an opportunity for that. As what I was alluding to before or describing before, as an organization, we've been able to really push forward. But I think there's a larger movement right now as we're building back better. I think, this is my personal opinion, that the pandemic has laid bare that there's a lot of global issues that are not very well addressed, by individual nation states necessarily. So on the vaccines, which was the positive aspect, showed that global collaboration really can move things very rapidly. And I do sense from our client base, from our suppliers, and in general, there is that momentum. The challenge now is to articulate it and convert that into action. So
Right.
we'll take that on as an organization, and we'll be reaching out to suppliers, clients, governments, and the likes to push that agenda.
And Alvin, maybe if I throw the last question to you about non-tariff barriers and the environment. When you've been doing your free trade agreements, do you get any sense that any of your partners are using sustainability as sort of a cover for traditional protection or non-tariff barriers?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important question. And there are just two aspects to it. The first is the first principles is to respect these trade rules. The WTO trade rules, the UNFCCC ones, but then also the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement has already been, 2015, but there has been changes, as I think our colleague mentioned earlier on, with the EU stance. It was last week, right, if I'm not wrong. What I wanted to just say for Singapore is that this EU-Singapore SFTA, which is very, very relevant to us, we already have incorporated a few very important aspects. The first is regards to lowering these tariffs. The second is to have this regulatory convergence. Now and that's why these FTAs are important. It enables us to work with countervailing counterparts to move at a pace that both countries are comfortable with. And it allows us to also make adjustments along the way, adjust the speeds. With regards to non-tariff barriers, I think there are many different aspects, and that's where the private sector also comes in, to ensure that consumers, but then also folks within these countries themselves, can apply some of these accountability pressures to say, okay, we need to enable and we need to ensure that our companies are also undergoing sustainable practices, and consumers are also voting with their dollars, just as people are voting with their votes as well. I think those are important aspects towards trade. So the EU-Singapore SFTA, please look into it. I think there are many important environmental chapters that are very relevant to both EU and Singapore, particularly the green chapters.
Great. Well, we've unfortunately come to the end of our time. Thanks for the audience for joining us today, and everybody who's been engaging with us online. And then, of course, thanks very much to my panelists, Alvin, Minister of State for Trade and Industry, Bandita Pant, Chief Commercial Officer of BHP, Malavika Bambwale from Engie Impact, Didla Blicher, MD APAC at Maersk, and La Louise Bender from Zalora. Thanks very much, panelists, for the discussion today.
Thank you, Simon.
I'd also like to thank Merle Hinrich for the video contribution to today's session, and more generally the Hinrich Foundation for their support of this session and the wider support for Asia Trade Week, which helps us to gather such excellent panels and excellent audience to discuss these important topics. Coming up next in Asia Trade Week is the Digital Imperatives. It's going to start at 2:30 p.m. Hong Kong or Singapore time. So if Digital Imperatives coming up, please make sure you log in at 2:30. Thanks very much, everyone.